My grandma left me everything. My family tried to erase me from the will. I'm 32, my name's Mark, and yesterday was the kind of day that rearranges how you look at your family in a way you can't put back. It started stupidly normal, which somehow makes everything worse. I woke up in my small apartment just outside Columbus, Ohio, a little hungover from the cheap IPA I'd had the night before, scrolled through my phone in bed, and saw the reminder I'd set. Meeting at 11 a.m., Grandma's estate. For a second, it didn't feel real. My grandma June's been gone for 3 months, and this meeting had been pushed back twice already because of paperwork delays. I made coffee, burned the toast like I always do, and ate it anyway over the sink. I remember the gray light coming in through the blinds and how quiet the street was, just the hum of a garbage truck in the distance. I had this weird heaviness in my chest that I kept telling myself was just anxiety about money and not about my family. I didn't grow up with money, exactly, but Grandma was the one person in the family who managed hers well. She had a paid-off little ranch house, a decent pension from working at the hospital, and these boring blue folders of investments she'd joke about at Thanksgiving. "I'm not rich," she'd say. "I'm just not stupid." My parents, on the other hand, have always been drowning in something. Credit card debt, car loans, random side hustles that never quite worked. My older sister, Jenna, works in real estate and always walks around like she's 2 deals away from being a millionaire, even though she still calls my mom when her car insurance is due. So this meeting at the lawyer's office felt important, but I'd convinced myself it would be simple. Split between the 3 of us, maybe a little extra to my mom because she took care of Grandma more at the end. That's what made sense in my head. On the drive downtown, the sky was this flat, pale white, and the roads were damp, but not actually raining. I put on some random podcast just to have noise, but I couldn't focus on it. I kept replaying stupid little memories. My grandma teaching me to make her meatloaf when I was 10, slipping me cash when she knew my card had been declined at the grocery store, or the time she told me quietly, "You're the only one who listens, Mark." I remember hearing that and feeling both good and weirdly guilty, like it was a job I hadn't known I'd signed up for. By the time I pulled into the parking garage near the lawyer's building, my stomach was in knots. I sat there for a minute, engine off, phone in my hand, just watching the condensation slowly fade from the windshield and thinking, it's just paperwork. It's not a big deal. People do this every day. The law office was on the 10th floor of one of those generic buildings that all smell like coffee and carpet cleaner. I got there 10 minutes early because that's just how I am, and when the elevator doors opened, my sister and my parents were already in the hallway. My dad was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, staring at his shoes. My mom was scrolling her phone, her mouth in this tight line. Jenna was pacing in heels, wearing this fitted blazer like she was about to close some big deal. They all looked up when they saw me. There was this half second where nobody said anything, and I felt like I'd walked into a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. My mom finally gave me this kind of forced smile and said I looked tired. I joked that it was just the fluorescent lighting, but nobody laughed. The receptionist led us into a small conference room with a long table, 2 mini chairs, and a bowl of stale-looking mints in the middle. There was a faint smell of someone's lunch from another office, like reheated pasta and garlic. I took a seat at the far end, not on purpose, it just happened, and my family clustered closer together on the opposite side. It was a little thing, but I noticed it. The lawyer, a guy in his 50s named Mr. Callahan, came in carrying a stack of folders and one big, thick manila envelope. He had that calm, neutral tone people in his job probably practice in the mirror. He shook everyone's hand, sat down, and started with the usual condolences and legal disclaimers. I was trying to listen, but my eyes kept going back to that envelope. It had my grandma's handwriting on the front, my full name and address neatly written in blue ink. When he said my name and slid the envelope toward me, I felt my whole body tighten. I didn't open it right away. I just rested my hand on it, feeling the rough paper under my fingers, and glanced at my mom. She was watching my hand, not my face. Jenna's jaw clenched, and she started tapping her nails on the table in this quick, annoyed rhythm. Mr. Callahan began reading the actual will out loud, and that's when things shifted. It was all very formal until he got to the part about the house. To my grandson, Mark, I leave my home, its contents, and the remainder of my financial accounts, with the hope that he will have the stability I never had. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavy. I heard the AC kick on. I heard someone's stomach growl. My own heartbeat sounded louder than his voice. I didn't react at first because my brain kind of stalled. My grandma left me everything? That couldn't be right. I looked at Mr. Callahan, waiting for some line like, and the rest is to be divided between, but it never came. My parents went from tense to stone. My dad's face flushed red, then pale. My mom's eyes started filling with tears, but not the sad kind, more like angry, shocked tears. Jenna let out this sharp, disbelieving laugh and then caught herself. She said something under her breath that I didn't catch, but it sounded like, of course she did. I remember my hands getting sweaty, the envelope slipping a little under my fingers. I hadn't done anything to ask for this. I hadn't even known this was a possibility. Suddenly, all those paperwork delays made a lot less sense. Mr. Callahan finished reading and started explaining next steps: transfer of title, access to accounts, tax stuff. But it felt like his words were coming from underwater. I could feel my family's eyes on me like spotlights. I finally opened the envelope, and inside was a handwritten letter from my grandma, folded in thirds, along with copies of some account statements. I didn't even read the numbers, just saw more zeros than I'd ever seen next to my name and felt my throat tighten. The letter started with "My dear Mark," and I stopped there because my vision blurred. I slid it back into the envelope, suddenly very aware that everyone could see my hands shaking. It felt wrong to read it in that room, with all their eyes on me like I'd just stolen something from them. The first thing my dad said, after what felt like a full minute of that awful silence, was about fairness. Not about grandma, not about how she must have felt to make that decision. Just that single word, heavy and sharp. He kept it low, but I could hear that tight, barely controlled anger in his voice. My mom started asking questions, but not to me, to the lawyer. Why wasn't she consulted? Why wasn't there a family discussion? Had grandma been in her right mind when she made those changes? That phrase made my stomach drop because I knew what it implied. I thought of all those evenings I'd sat with grandma at her kitchen table, talking about nothing and everything, and how clear she'd been, even near the end. She was forgetful with small things sometimes, but not about what mattered. The idea that they were going to poke at that made something hot flare up in my chest. As they kept talking over each other, I just sat there staring at the grain of the table, tracing a little scratch in the wood with my thumb. I could smell my dad's aftershave, that same sharp cologne he's worn since I was a kid. I could hear Jenna's bracelets clinking every time she gestured with her hand. It all felt too detailed, like my brain was grabbing at random sensory things so it wouldn't have to fully process what was happening. I realized I was holding my breath, so I exhaled slowly and tried to sit up straighter. I didn't want to look like a guilty person in some interrogation. I hadn't done anything, but the way they were talking made me feel like I had. Mr. Callahan cleared his throat and mentioned that my grandma had updated her will twice in the last few years, and that this final version had been signed and witnessed just 6 months before she passed. He said it in this careful, neutral way, like he'd had this conversation before and knew where it usually went. My mom asked if there had been a previous version more in line with the family's expectations. The way she said "family" didn't sound like it included me. He nodded and said there had been, years ago, and that in that version things were divided more evenly. Jenna jumped on that immediately, asking what had changed and when and why. I watched my dad's jaw clench so tight I thought he'd crack a tooth. Something in the air shifted from shock into something sharper, more focused. They weren't just upset. They were gearing up for something. When Mr. Callahan mentioned there had been some communications and requests from my family in the months before the final version was signed, both my parents stiffened. It was subtle, but I saw it. Almost like someone had hit pause on them for a second. He glanced at them, then at me, and said he had documentation of those requests. That was the first moment I felt like I'd missed something big, like a whole part of the story had been going on behind my back. I thought about all the times my mom had mentioned being so busy with grandma's appointments, and how she'd brushed off any offer from me to help with the paperwork. "We've got it, Mark," she'd say. "You just focus on your own stuff." Sitting there in that stiff conference chair, envelope in front of me, I realized maybe I was never supposed to see whatever they'd been handling. I sat there trying to keep my breathing steady while the air in the room turned thick in a way I can't really describe. It felt like the temperature went up even though the AC was humming. Mr. Callahan excused himself for a minute to grab an additional file he said might be relevant, and the door clicked shut behind him. The moment we were alone, the energy shifted hard. My sister leaned back in her chair with her arms crossed, staring at me like I'd just cut her in line for something expensive. My mom wiped her eyes with a tissue she'd pulled from her purse, but it wasn't grief. It was frustration. My dad didn't say a word. He just kept looking at the door like he wished he could bolt out of it. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I stayed quiet and kept reading the front of the envelope as if the answers were written there. The silence dragged on for so long that I started hearing the faint buzz of the ceiling lights. When Mr. Callahan came back, he placed a thinner folder on the table, opened it slowly, and explained that there had been attempts by my parents. He didn't say pressure, but it was pretty close, to have the will re-evaluated about 8 months before Grandma died. Hearing that made my stomach twist. I looked at them, waiting for some explanation, but my mom just blinked fast like she'd been caught off guard. My dad's face hardened into something unreadable. Jenna looked between them and then at me, almost calculating. Mr. Callahan kept talking, saying there had been inquiries about transferring the house while Grandma was still alive and questions about accessing certain accounts for her comfort. He said it in such a careful way that I understood exactly what he was trying not to accuse anyone of. The back of my neck got hot, and my palms were sweating. It was like watching a slow drip of truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Seeing that folder made something click in my head. I suddenly remembered little moments over the last year. My mom mentioning, almost casually, that Grandma wasn't really using the extra bedrooms anymore. My dad asking if I thought Grandma might want to downsize into assisted living for her own safety. Jenna complaining that the house was wasted space sitting on equity. Stuff I'd brushed off because I didn't want to assume anything ugly. Now all those comments were stacking up in front of me like puzzle pieces I hadn't realized belonged together. My chest felt tight, and I kept trying to swallow the lump in my throat. I didn't want to lose it in front of them, but something about knowing they'd been trying to move pieces around while I'd been eating meatloaf with her at the kitchen table felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. I asked, quietly, because my voice wasn't steady, why none of them had ever mentioned those conversations with Grandma. My mom immediately said they were just exploring options and that it wasn't appropriate to bring me into stressful situations. That line hit me wrong. It had that tone parents use when they're talking to a child, not a grown man. My dad finally jumped in, saying that they'd been trying to protect the family's future and that I would have understood if I'd bothered to show up more. I felt my face get hot because that wasn't true. I'd been there almost every weekend. I'd taken Grandma to the grocery store, to her doctor's appointments when they couldn't. But saying that out loud felt pointless. The way he said it wasn't about facts. It was about rewriting the story to make themselves look better. Jenna chimed in next, and her voice had this edge I'd never really heard from her. She said it didn't make sense for Grandma to leave everything to the kid who never plans ahead when the rest of them actually had responsibilities. The word kid stung more than I expected. I'm 32. I've been paying my own rent, utilities, and student loans without help from anyone. But in that room, hearing her say it with that condescending tone, I suddenly felt 12 years old again. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, and I had to force myself not to snap back. It wouldn't have helped. Nothing I said would have landed with people who'd already decided the story they wanted. Mr. Callahan tried to steer the conversation back to logistics, but the tension in the room had gotten thick. My mom leaned forward and asked if the will could be contested on the basis of influence. That word hit like a punch. Influence. Like I'd somehow manipulated Grandma. Like our relationship, the one soft spot in my life, was some strategic move on my part. I felt something cold slide down inside me. I tried to ask what she meant, but she avoided eye contact, staring instead at the corner of a contract like it would give her courage. My dad muttered something about fair distribution, and Jenna nodded along without even pretending to hide her irritation. The lawyer explained that contesting would be extremely difficult given the documentation, the witnesses, and the timing. He said it all calmly, but I could tell he'd seen this kind of implosion before. The moment he said it would be difficult, my sister let out this frustrated exhale and dropped her pen on the table so hard it made a sharp clicking sound. My mom tried to hide the fact that her hands were shaking as she folded and unfolded her tissue. My dad leaned back in his chair and rubbed the bridge of his nose like the whole thing was happening to him, like he hadn't been part of those earlier inquiries. I kept staring at the table, tracing that same scratch in the wood with my thumb, grounding myself because it felt like the room was tilting slightly. Everything felt unreal, like a dream where emotions hit harder because you can't control anything. When Mr. Callahan mentioned that Grandma had written an additional letter addressed to the family, my mom immediately asked to see it. But he didn't hand it to her. He slid it toward the middle of the table and said it was meant for all of us. I watched the three of them look at it like it was something radioactive. The envelope was smaller than mine, and the handwriting was shakier, but still hers. I could smell the faint scent of old paper when he opened it and unfolded the letter. He read it out loud, her words thanking them for their help in ways big and small, but also mentioning that she had made her decision after much thought, because she wanted at least one person in the family to have a foundation to fall back on. When he said that part, my sister scoffed quietly. My dad stared at his hands. My mom's jaw tightened. The letter went on, explaining that she hoped they'd understand her choice someday, that she loved them but needed to do what felt right to her. There was no apology in her words, no attempt to soften the decision. It was simple, honest, almost blunt. Hearing it said out loud made my chest ache. I could picture her writing it at that little kitchen table, the same one she'd sat at every morning with her coffee and crossword. I wondered if she knew the kind of storm this letter would unleash. My mom wiped her eyes again, but there was something sharper in her expression now, like the letter confirmed something she'd been dreading. When the meeting wrapped up, nobody moved at first. It was like we were all waiting for someone else to make the next move, but no one knew what that move was. My dad stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with this loud, ugly sound. He didn't look at me. My sister grabbed her purse so quickly she knocked over one of the pens, but she didn't bother picking it up. My mom lingered, staring at the table, her eyes red but not soft. I stayed seated because my legs felt heavy, like getting up too fast might make something worse spill out of me. Eventually, everyone shuffled out into the hallway, but the silence followed us like a shadow. When we stepped into the hallway, the air felt colder, like the temperature dropped the second the door shut behind us. My family clustered together near the elevators, whispering in this tense, sharp way that made it clear I wasn't supposed to hear. I stood a few feet back, pretending to check my phone even though I wasn't reading anything. Every now and then, I caught pieces of their hushed conversation, words like unreasonable, options, lawyer, and once, from Jenna, a very clear he doesn't deserve it. Hearing that out loud hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt my face get hot again, and for a second, I considered just taking the stairs and avoiding them entirely. But something in me knew that walking away too fast would only give them more fuel to spin their version of things. When the elevator arrived, the four of us stepped in, and the doors closed with a soft thud. The ride down felt endless. Nobody pressed any buttons for a moment, like everyone was waiting for someone else to act. My mom finally reached out and hit L, her finger trembling just slightly. The mirrored walls made it impossible to avoid seeing their faces, even when I looked down at my shoes. My dad's jaw was locked, his eyes focused straight ahead. Jenna had her arms crossed tight across her chest, tapping her foot rapidly. My mom just stared at the elevator doors, blinking hard. I stood in the corner, hands in my pockets, feeling like an intruder in my own family. The only sound was the faint hum of the elevator cables and someone's shallow breathing, maybe mine. When the doors opened into the building lobby, the sunlight coming through the glass wall made everything feel too bright. My dad didn't wait for anyone. He walked straight toward the exit, pushing the glass door harder than necessary. My sister followed him immediately. My mom stayed behind for a second and looked at me. It wasn't a warm look. It wasn't even a sad look. It was assessing, like she was trying to figure out if I was going to do something unpredictable. She opened her mouth like she was about to say something, then closed it again. Instead, she gave the stiff nod and walked away. I stayed where I was, trying to untangle the knot in my chest. People walked past me, office workers on lunch break, a guy with a bike helmet, a couple talking about where to eat, and none of them had any clue that the ground under my feet felt like it had shifted. Outside, the sky had darkened a bit, and the air felt heavy, like it might rain. I spotted my family standing near my dad's car, all three of them talking fast and low. When my mom glanced up and saw me, she nudged my dad's arm, and they all stopped talking at the exact same time. They didn't wave me over. They didn't ask me to join the conversation. They just stared for a second before Jenna rolled her eyes and got into the car. My parents followed, and within a few seconds, they were pulling out of the lot without a single gesture in my direction. I watched the car merge into traffic and disappear, and for a moment, the whole world felt weirdly quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in that way that feels empty. I went back to my own car, but didn't get in right away. I leaned against the door and took a few slow breaths, trying to calm the buzzing in my head. My phone buzzed with a notification, just a stupid spam text, but holding it grounded me for a second. The manila envelope was still in my hand, and I felt its weight like it was something alive. I didn't want to open it in the parking garage where everything echoed and smelled like oil and dust, so I got in, shut the door, and just sat there. The silence inside the car was loud. I put the envelope on the passenger seat and stared at it while the engine idled. My stomach churned with a mix of guilt, confusion, and something else I didn't want to name yet: anger. Eventually, I drove home, gripping the steering wheel a little too tight. The road was slick from a light drizzle, and traffic was slow, which gave me too much time to think. I replayed the meeting in my head over and over, like picking at a scab. Every expression on their faces, every muttered word, every little detail I'd ignored until now. I thought about Grandma's house, the smell of her lavender hand lotion, the squeaky step on the back porch, the chipped blue mug she used every morning, and what it meant that she'd chosen me. She'd never said anything about it. She never dropped hints or made comments. She just acted like she always did, calm, practical, caring. I realized then that she must have known exactly how they'd react. That made something tighten in my chest in a way I couldn't shake. When I pulled into my apartment lot, it had started raining lightly again. I grabbed the envelope and ran inside, shaking water off my jacket as I shut the door behind me. The apartment felt dim, like the gray weather had leaked into the room. I tossed my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the couch. For a long time, I just held the envelope, running my fingers along the edges. My hands were still shaking. Eventually, I opened it again and unfolded Grandma's letter. This time, I forced myself to read it. Her handwriting dipped and wavered in places, but it was still undeniably hers. She wrote about loving me, being proud of me, and wanting to give me the stability she never had growing up. She mentioned that she made her decisions, knowing the consequences, which hit me hard. I felt my throat tighten as I pictured her writing that line alone in her quiet house. After I read the letter, I sat back and stared at the ceiling, letting the words sink in. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel lucky. I felt this weird cocktail of grief, gratitude, and dread. I knew what was waiting for me after this: the phone calls, the arguments, the accusations, the shifting of blame. I could already hear my sister's voice in my head, sharp and bitter. I knew my parents would try to reshape the narrative until they were the victims, and I was the selfish one. I'd seen them do it with other things. But this wasn't a broken appliance or a misunderstanding about a holiday visit. This was the house my grandma lived in for 40 years. This was her life savings. This was her trust. I eventually got up and made myself a grilled cheese, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to do something normal. The smell of butter sizzling on the pan was comforting in a small, pathetic way. I ate it standing over the sink, staring out the window at the wet pavement and the flickering street lamp. My phone buzzed twice, 2 missed calls from my mom. I didn't listen to the voicemail. I wasn't ready. I put the phone face down on the counter like it might burn me if I looked at it again. Later in the evening, as the rain picked up and tapped softly against the window, I sat at my little dining table with the letter open in front of me again. I kept reading the last paragraph. Please don't let this tear you apart from them, but also don't let them take from you what I chose to give. My chest tightened so hard it felt like someone had pressed a fist there. She'd known. She'd known exactly who they were and how they'd react. She'd written that line for a moment she wouldn't be alive to see. That realization hit me harder than anything else that day. By the time it got fully dark, I was exhausted in a way that didn't feel physical. I turned on the lamp in the corner, and the soft yellow light made the room feel smaller. I started going through the other documents: bank statements, transfer forms, instructions from the lawyer, and each one felt heavier than the last. At one point, I had to stop because my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped a stack of papers. I pressed the heels of my palms into my eyes and took slow breaths until the shaking eased. I didn't know if it was stress or guilt or fear. Probably all of them. It was sometime around 9 when my phone buzzed again. This time, It was a text from Jenna. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Don't ignore this. No explanation. No attempt at civility. Just that. I stared at the screen for a long time before locking the phone and setting it aside. Part of me wanted to respond, if only to defend myself. But another part of me, the tired, bruised part, knew nothing I said would matter. They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for someone to blame. I left the phone on the table and walked to the kitchen sink, splashing cold water on my face just to ground myself. The shock of it helped for a second, but as soon as I dried my face with a paper towel, the heaviness crept back in. I kept thinking about Grandma's line about consequences, and it made my chest ache in this dull, dragging way. I paced around the apartment a little, rubbing the back of my neck, feeling like I couldn't sit still but also couldn't stand to move too much. There was this weird pressure behind my ribs, like everything that happened in that conference room had settled somewhere inside me and didn't know where to go. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't think of a single person who wouldn't turn this into gossip or awkward sympathy. So I just walked circles in my living room while the rain tapped harder against the window. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down at the table and look at the documents again. The financial statements were neat, organized, labeled with dates and notes in Grandma's handwriting. Seeing her handwriting on those pages felt intimate in a way that made my throat tighten. She'd been preparing for this quietly, without telling anyone, while my parents had been trying to move pieces around behind closed doors. The contrast between those two things hit me hard. I ran my fingers over the edge of one paper and caught a faint smell of her house. Books, dust, lemon cleaner. I didn't know if it was real or my brain trying to comfort me, but it brought back a wave of grief, so sudden I had to put the papers down and lean back in my chair, breathing slow, steady breaths to stop the burning in my eyes. After a while, I turned on the TV just for noise, some random news channel, but I wasn't watching it. I couldn't focus on anything. My eyes kept drifting to the envelope, then to my silent phone, then back to the window. At one point, a loud thunderclap shook the glass a little, and it startled me enough that my heart kicked hard in my chest. The storm outside was getting worse, and the wind was rattling the siding of the building. It made the apartment feel more isolated than usual, like I was tucked away in some pocket of quiet the rest of the world wasn't paying attention to. It matched how I felt, cut off from everything that had made sense that morning. Around 10, I finally listened to the voicemails. My mom's voice was tight, controlled, like she was trying hard not to sound harsh. She said things had gotten heated, that they needed to discuss family matters calmly, and that Grandma couldn't have fully understood the consequences of her choice. Hearing that last part made something in my stomach clench. The second voicemail was shorter, just her telling me to call back as soon as possible. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the way they'd looked at me in that conference room, just urgency and expectation. I deleted both messages without saving them. I decided to take a shower, hoping it would clear my head. The hot water helped for a minute. I leaned my forehead against the tile and tried to let the noise of the water drown out the thoughts spinning in my skull. But the second I stepped out, wrapped in a towel, everything came rushing back. I wiped the mirror with my hand, and my reflection looked exhausted, eyes red, shoulders tense, jaw tight. I didn't look like myself. I looked like someone caught in the middle of a family storm he didn't ask for. I brushed my teeth, turned off the bathroom light, and sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the rain hammering harder against the windows. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through social media, but every post felt fake and loud and pointless. I tossed my phone next to me and lay back, staring at the ceiling fan slowly turning in the dim light. The room smelled faintly like soap and steam, and the quiet moments between thunderclaps felt too tense, like the air was waiting for something to break. I thought about Grandma's laugh, the way she'd scrunch her nose when she smiled, the way her house always felt warm even in winter. And then I thought about how my parents had looked at me today, like I'd betrayed them. The guilt twisted deeper even though I knew, intellectually, that I hadn't done anything wrong. But emotions don't work like math. Sometime close to 11, my phone buzzed again, this time a text from my mom. "We're a family. We can fix this if you're reasonable." I stared at the message, jaw tightening. Reasonable. The same word she'd used my whole life whenever I questioned something that made me uncomfortable. The same tone she used when she wanted me to fold. I didn't respond. Instead, I set the phone on silent and slid it under my pillow, like physical distance would keep their words from crawling under my skin. I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark. Only the streetlight outside cast a faint glow through the curtains. But I couldn't sleep. My brain kept replaying every detail of the meeting. The look on my dad's face when the will was read, Jenna's scoff. The way my mom's voice cracked when she asked if the will could be contested. I kept hearing that word, influence. It made my skin crawl. I knew they'd hold on to that idea, pick at it, stretch it, shape it into something convenient. I knew tomorrow would be worse. I lay there listening to the storm until the thunder started rolling farther away, leaving only the steady rain. Just after midnight, I got out of bed and went back to the table. I turned on the lamp again, opened Grandma's letter one more time, and traced her signature at the bottom with my thumb. The pen strokes were uneven but strong. She'd written it on one of her old floral stationery sheets, the ones she used for thank you notes. Seeing that familiar pattern made something crack quietly inside me. I whispered a soft, "I miss you," and it came out rough, like my voice didn't know how to handle the words. I sat there for a long time, letting the quiet settle around me. The storm outside had finally faded into a light drizzle, and the tapping against the window was steady, almost calming. I realized then that nothing about today had settled. The letter had changed everything. My family's reaction had changed everything. The silence in my apartment felt like the start of some long, uncomfortable road I didn't know how to walk. I closed the letter, folded it neatly, and put it back in the envelope. For the first time since leaving the lawyer's office, I let myself admit something I hadn't wanted to face. Grandma had trusted me, but she'd also warned me. And now I finally understood why.